There is a grain that contains more iron per gram than beef, more calcium than any other cereal on Earth, a complete protein with all 9 essential amino acids, almost unheard of in a plant. It is naturally gluten-free. It is drought-resistant. It costs almost nothing to grow, and it has fed an entire civilization continuously for over 5,000 years. The seeds are smaller than a poppy, so small that one of their names, in the language of the people who first cultivated them, simply means lost, because if you drop one on the ground, you will never find it again. A single handful is enough to plant an entire field. In 2003, a Dutch businessman filed a patent on it. By 2007, he legally owned the right to control flour made from a grain that humans had been eating for 5,000 years before his country existed. And the people whose ancestors domesticated it, before the pyramids, before the wheel, before written language, were suddenly committing patent infringement by selling their own staple food to Europe. Welcome to Verdant Vault. Subscribe and hit the bell. Every share protects what they tried to bury. Its name is Teff, Eragrostis Teff, an annual grass native to the highlands of what are now Ethiopia and Eritrea, where it was first domesticated somewhere between 4000 and 1000 BC. The Ethiopian highlands are one of only a handful of places on Earth that scientists call a primary center of plant domestication. And teff was the grain those highlands chose. The seed itself is almost absurdly small, less than 1 millimeter in diameter, smaller than a poppy seed. The Amharic word for it is believed to derive from the verb meaning to lose, because once you scatter the seeds in a field, they are gone. You cannot pick them up. You cannot count them. They simply disappear into the soil, and weeks later, the field is full of grass. That smallness is also why it survived. A handful of teff weighs almost nothing, travels easily, stores easily. For semi-nomadic peoples moving across the Ethiopian highlands, teff was the perfect crop. It withstood drought. It tolerated waterlogged soil. It thrived from sea level to over 3,000 meters of altitude. It grew where wheat could not, where corn would not, where almost no other cereal would survive. For 5 millennia, this tiny grain was ground into flour, fermented for 2 to 3 days, using the wild yeasts living on its own surface, and poured onto a hot clay griddle to make injera, the spongy, tangy sourdough flatbread that is still the foundation of Ethiopian and Eritrean cuisine. 2/3 of the daily protein intake of an entire nation comes from this single grain. Mothers in Addis Ababa today are feeding their children the same fermented bread that mothers in the same highlands were feeding their children when the Great Pyramid was still being built. This is teff, and what is inside it is the reason an entire industry, half a world away, decided it had to own it. A 2021 study published in the journal Helion used inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry to measure the mineral content of teff against the wheat and maize grown in the same Ethiopian volcanic soil. The results were not subtle. Iron in teff was 159 milligrams per kilogram. Iron in wheat from the same soil was 33 milligrams per kilogram. Iron in maize was 13 milligrams per kilogram. Teff carried nearly 5 times the iron of wheat and over 12 times the iron of maize. Compare that to beef. Raw beef round contains roughly 2 milligrams of iron per 100 grams of edible portion. Teff, gram for gram, carries more iron than the meat doctors prescribe to anemic patients. And unlike beef, it requires no animals, no slaughterhouses, no refrigeration, no feedlots. It is just a grass that grows in volcanic soil. Calcium concentrations in teff measured 3.5 times higher than wheat and 34 times higher than maize. Magnesium, manganese, copper, every essential mineral the human body needs in trace amounts, are present in concentrations that no other staple grain matches. And then there is the protein. Teff is one of the rare plant foods on Earth that contains a complete protein. It contains all 9 essential amino acids that the human body cannot synthesize on its own. It is exceptionally high in lysine, the amino acid most often deficient in cereal grains, and the one missing from wheat, rice, and corn. It contains roughly 8 grams of protein per cooked cup. It is the only ancient grain known to contain measurable vitamin C. And it is 20 to 40% resistant starch, the slow-release carbohydrate that prevents blood sugar spikes and feeds beneficial gut bacteria. This is not folklore. This is a grain that has been measured, weighed, and lab-tested across multiple universities and continents. It is the most nutritionally dense cereal humans have ever cultivated. Older than written history. Cheaper than dirt. Available right now to anyone in the Ethiopian highlands with a piece of land and a clay griddle. So ask yourself a simple question. If a grain like this exists, why have most Americans never heard of it? Imagine a baker in Amsterdam. Her parents emigrated from Addis Ababa in the 1990s. She has been baking injera the same way her grandmother taught her, fermenting teff flour with wild yeast, pouring the batter onto a hot clay surface, and lifting the spongy bread off 3 minutes later. She sells it at a small storefront in the Bielmer neighborhood. Her customers are other Ethiopian and Eritrean families who cannot find injera anywhere else in the city. One morning, she opens her mail and finds a cease and desist letter. A Dutch company is informing her that the bread her grandmother taught her to bake, using a grain her ancestors domesticated 4,000 years before any European set foot in Africa, is now legally protected intellectual property. To continue baking it, she must license it from them in her own city in Europe. This was not a hypothetical. This was the legal reality across half of the European Union for over a decade. Starting in 2007, Ethiopian farmers and exporters were locked out of Belgium, Germany, Austria, Italy, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. 6 European countries where their grandmother's grain was suddenly someone else's property. Bakels, one of Europe's largest baking conglomerates, was sued for selling Teff baked goods. Smaller Ethiopian-owned businesses faced the same legal exposure but lacked the resources to fight. They simply stopped exporting, stopped selling. The grain that had fed their families for 5,000 years was no longer theirs to bring to market in the wealthy countries that suddenly wanted it. Meanwhile, in those same European supermarkets, Teff flour appeared on the gluten-free aisle at premium prices. 12 euros per kilogram. 15 euros per kilogram. The grain Ethiopian families could once buy for pennies was now being sold to wealthy Europeans, the proceeds flowing not back to the farmers who had cultivated it for 50 centuries, but to the company that had filed paperwork on it in 2003. The country of origin received 4,000 euros over the entire 5-year cooperation period. 4,000 euros. For commercial access to a national grain that had sustained the population for 50 centuries. While European bakers, who had never grown a stalk of teff in their lives, paid licensing fees to a Dutch company to handle the same flour Ethiopian grandmothers had been handling since the Bronze Age. This is what theft looks like in the modern food system. It does not arrive with soldiers or bulldozers. It arrives with a courier, a sealed envelope, and a patent number on the letterhead. But the Dutch patent was not a glitch in the system. It was the blueprint. You cannot patent teff itself. The genetic material is older than any patent office, older than any country's borders, older than the legal concept of intellectual property by several thousand years. But you can patent the processing of teff. This is the loophole, the mechanism, the legal architecture that allows ancient food knowledge to be converted into private corporate property without ever technically claiming to own the plant. The Dutch businessman did not patent the grain. He patented the flour. He patented storage protocols. He patented moisture ranges. He claimed he had invented a stable gluten-free teff flour product, even though Ethiopian farmers had been storing harvested teff to improve flour quality for thousands of years, because anyone who farms teff in Ethiopia knows it as common practice. The European Patent Office reviewed his application anyway. By 2007, the patent was granted. Patent number EP1646287. And once the patent existed, every farmer, baker, and exporter in the country that had domesticated the grain became a potential infringer in the markets where the patent applied. This is the model. Identify a food native to a poorer country with no large corporate apparatus to defend it. Patent a small adjustment to how the food is processed. The genetic material remains nominally free, but the entire commercial pathway to international markets becomes legally controlled by a single corporate owner. The grandmother in the Ethiopian highland keeps her grain. She loses access to every wealthy market that could pay her for it. 75% of plant DNA is currently controlled by private corporate ownership. Of that, 50% is held by just 14 transnational corporations. The architecture of modern food law is designed to convert ancient agricultural knowledge into intellectual property, and the people who built that knowledge over thousands of years receive almost nothing for it. You cannot patent 5,000 years of farming. You cannot legally own the labor of every Ethiopian grandmother who ever fermented batter on a clay griddle. You cannot rewrite the history of a food whose story began before your country existed. But you can build a paperwork system that pretends you can. And the global trade system will treat your paperwork as if it is real until somebody, somewhere, spends a decade in court forcing the courts to admit it is not. That is exactly what Ethiopia had to do. The Ethiopian Intellectual Property Office spent over 15 years fighting this patent. They appealed to the World Intellectual Property Organization. They negotiated, and they launched public campaigns. The Ethiopian Attorney General's office formally pursued international arbitration in 2018. And in 2019, after a separate infringement lawsuit between two Dutch companies reached the district court in The Hague, the court invalidated the Dutch Teff patent on grounds of lack of inventive step. Storing harvested teff to improve flour quality, the court ruled, was not an invention. Ethiopian farmers had been doing exactly that for thousands of years. The German part of the patent was waived shortly after. The remaining patents in Belgium, Italy, Austria, and the United Kingdom expired in 2024. The grain outlived the paperwork, and while the lawyers were arguing in The Hague, the grain was doing something else. It was producing the greatest distance runners in human history. Haile Gebrselassie set 27 world records over distances from 800 meters to the full marathon, attributing his physical capacity to a teff-based diet. Kenenisa Bekele holds the world record in the 5,000 meters and the 10,000 meters. Tirunesh Dibaba dominated her events for a decade. In April 2016, Ethiopian runners took 5 of the top 6 spots at the Boston Marathon. The pattern repeats every year in every major distance race on every continent. A 2012 study at Manchester Metropolitan University asked 11 female runners to replace their usual wheat bread with teff bread for 6 weeks. Their daily iron intake rose from a deficient 10.7 milligrams to a healthy 18.5 milligrams. They improved their performance at the anaerobic threshold. They increased their time to exhaustion. They raised their maximal oxygen uptake at peak performance. The grain that a Dutch company tried to lock out of Europe was simultaneously being measured in clinical trials as one of the most performance-enhancing whole foods on Earth. In Ethiopia, teff still covers more agricultural land than any other crop, over 30% of total cultivated acreage. Over 6 million Ethiopian households still farm it. Injera is still the daily bread of an entire nation. The fermentation cultures used to make it have been passed from mother to daughter for 5,000 years without interruption. In the United States, teff has been commercially grown in Idaho since the 1980s, originally to supply the Ethiopian American immigrant community. It is now grown across Idaho, Michigan, Nevada, and Oregon. You can buy a 1-pound bag of teff flour from American grocery chains and online retailers right now. Brown teff, ivory teff, whole grain, stone ground. The grain is here, the bread is here, the 5,000-year-old recipe is here. Waiting in plain sight on a shelf you have probably walked past 100 times without noticing. A grain so small it disappears into the soil. A grain that fed a civilization for 5,000 years. A grain that produces the greatest distance runners in human history. A grain that contains more iron, gram for gram, than the meat the rest of the world is told to eat for iron. and a paperwork system that decided in 2003 that a Dutch businessman should own it. That spent over a decade pretending he did. That cost the country of origin 15 years of courtroom battles to undo. You do not need a patent office's permission to eat what humans ate for 5,000 years. You do not need a corporation's license to bake the bread that grandmothers in the Ethiopian highlands have been baking continuously since the Bronze Age. You do not need anyone's blessing to remember that the most nutritious grain on earth belongs to the people who built it, not to the people who tried to file paperwork on it. The grain is still here, still growing in the volcanic soils of Ethiopia, still being baked into injera in homes from Addis Ababa to Asmara to Atlanta. Still feeding the runners who keep winning the world's marathons while the world keeps wondering why. It is waiting for hands willing to grind it. If this vault opens something for you, subscribe to Verdant Vault and hit the bell. Every like and every share preserves what they tried to bury. The next vault opens soon.